Tyrion Lannister had always believed that a single moment, a single twist of fate, could radically alter the course of life in the Seven Kingdoms. He had never imagined just how far-reaching a simple shift in rumor or blame might be until he stood on the dais with goblet in hand, watching King Joffrey choke at his own wedding feast. Sansa was beside him, her face pale and eyes wide as the king's coughing echoes ricocheted off the high stone walls of the Red Keep's courtyard. Across the table, Cersei rose in alarm, her wine sloshing over the rim of her cup. The sound of trumpets and laughter had been replaced by screams and frantic shouts for Maester Pycelle. Yet in that moment, the swirling chaos was somehow slower for Tyrion. Joffrey's convulsing form, Margaery's horrified expression, Tywin's moment of shock, and yes, Tyrion's own distinct sense of confusion. For at that pivotal instant even he did not realize what was truly happening. He saw only the grotesque spectacle of a cruel young king turning purple, his eyes bulging, his golden crown askew. Though Tyrion was reaching out as if to help, his thoughts were a maelstrom of possible explanations. Poison was at the top of his list. Joffrey had made enough enemies, near and far, to fill the banquet hall twice over. But he did not see the faint residue of any blame shifting instantly upon him, did not hear his father's voice or sister's voice crying out against him. Instead, he witnessed guards rushing forward, lifting the king from the ground, calling for help. At the corners of his vision, Tyrion noticed Peter Baelish stepping away, disappearing among the throng of courtiers, while Olenna Tyrell beckoned for her granddaughter to step back from the dying boy. All the while, Tyrion stood rooted to the ground, Sansa's hand clutching his arm. It was only later he would realize precisely how that scene might have played out differently if the seeds of suspicion had bloomed in the mind of the crowd. And yet, on that fateful day, Tyrion would not be the one singled out. A hush fell upon the courtyard as Joffrey's final breath rattled in his throat and silence took the place of the earlier festivities. From somewhere in the throng of guests, a lady from House Redwyne shrieked that it must be the work of dark sorcery. More guests echoed her sentiment, each spinning theories that made little sense. Whispers of poison and betrayal blossomed instantly. But as the Kingsguard carried Joffrey's body away from the table and as the Queen Mother sank to her knees, Tyrion found himself drawn to the cold satisfaction that, perhaps, cosmic justice had been done. In a heartbeat, that twinge of satisfaction was replaced by worry for Sansa. If suspicion turned on them, they would not survive the day. Yet as he glanced around, he did not see the immediate condemnation from his sister. Instead, he saw her eyes dart toward Margaery Tyrell as if Cersei suspected something in the new queen's proximity or the Tyrells' well-timed caution. Cersei's features twisted in raw grief, but her fury did not point at him. In that single moment, fate had decided to cast the dice differently. For Tyrion Lannister, destiny had taken a strange turn indeed. Chaos reigned in the hours after Joffrey's death. Guards roamed the castle in squads, stopping any who crossed their path, demanding explanations that no one possessed. Margaery was whisked away to her chambers, hysterical. Olenna Tyrell demanded an audience with the king's hand, though the king was now dead. Tywin Lannister, grim-faced and cold-eyed, took immediate control of the situation. Servants were interrogated, wineskins were seized, and the feast was abruptly cancelled. Tyrion lingered in the courtyard, half forgotten, while Sansa clutched his arm, trembling. He could see the cunning in Littlefinger's eyes from across the yard as the man quietly slipped away. Varys hovered close by, wearing that unreadable half-smile like a spider preparing to dine on the city's newly spun webs of intrigue. Tyrion knew well that if suspicion did not leap at him now, it could still coil around him later. His father would never allow a regicide to go unpunished, especially when the name Lannister was as much about power as it was about gold and lineage. But as the day crept into evening, it was not Tyrion whom the crown's enforcers seized for questioning. Instead, they directed their suspicion first at a royal taster who had fled the scene the instant Joffrey began to choke. That man, trembling and terrified, claimed he had done nothing but sample the wine as he always did. Yet the seeds of doubt had already grown. A taster never leaves the king's side without some reason, some fear. Tyrion silently watched the man protest as guards dragged him away. Cersei did not rise to defend the man's innocence. She merely stood there, tears shining in her eyes, her rage swirling like a storm that had not yet decided where to strike. Night fell over King's Landing and the Red Keep's corridors brimmed with uneasy tension. Joffrey's body lay in the sept, guarded day and night by the silent, gleaming figures of the King's Guard. A terrible hush descended upon the city. The small folk spoke in hushed whispers of the king's cruelty and wondered if, at last, the gods had intervened to grant them a reprieve from his vicious, unpredictable reign. Others, still loyal or at least fearful, anticipated vengeance from Queen Cersei and the new King Tommen. The Tyrells remained in the palace but behind closed doors, clearly concerned for Marjorie's safety and reputation. In her own chambers, Sansa would lie awake, her eyes fixed on the drapes that rustled with any passing breeze. Tyrion took to pacing the hallways late at night, half expecting Ser Marentrant or another of the King's Guard to descend upon him. Yet no accusation came. No soldier appeared. His father was remote, locked in council with Kevan Lannister and Pycelle, deciding the next political move. Even that sense of relief unsettled Tyrion. He was no fool. He knew the question of Joffrey's murderer would haunt the castle. If Tywin believed the Tyrells had orchestrated the killing, or if Peter Baelish had contrived something from the shadows, or if a nameless conspirator was found among the scullions, it would shape the alliances and animosities for years to come. But one thing seemed certain. The immediate blame did not fall at Tyrion's feet, though he could not decide if that was a blessing or yet another piece on the chessboard that his father was carefully moving into place. In the days that followed, the official inquiry began. Tywin held court in the throne room, a somber affair that replaced the usual grand spectacle. Golden candlelight flickered over the iron throne, highlighting its razor edges and the twisted swords that formed its menacing shape. Tommen, barely able to keep still, watched with wide eyes from the royal dais. Cersei stood to one side, her black mourning clothes making her look even paler than usual, and her gaze often flickered toward Marjorie, who maintained a posture of poised sorrow. The taster who had fled during the feast was questioned first. He stammered out his routine. Sample each dish, each cup, ensure no poison had touched the king's plate. Tyrion listened from the sidelines, noticing how the man seemed desperate to please, to exonerate himself. When the man claimed he had indeed tested each sip and found no sign of toxins, Tywin's eyes narrowed. Cersei's lips curled in disdain. Maester Pycelle presented a small bottle containing residue he claimed to have found on the royal chalice, but it was inconclusive. The wine had been spilled everywhere in the uproar. Worse yet, a scullery maid stepped forward, pale as a corpse, to insist that she had seen one of the Tyrell guards near the wine casks before the feast. Uncertainty thickened the air like a lingering haze of incense. Tyrion kept his eyes on his father, reading every minute twitch in the old lion's jaw. If Tywin suspected Tyrion's involvement, he would have used this occasion to strike. But Tywin was no man to mince words. He did not even glance Tyrion's way. Instead, his penetrating stare fell on the Tyrell representatives. Olenna Tyrell, for her part, looked exhausted, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual. She offered her condolences with the smoothness of a seasoned courtier, but did not yield any sign of guilt. By the end of that day, the inquiry had revealed no single culprit, only a swirl of accusations that touched the Tyrells, the castle servants, even, some whispered, Varys himself. Cersei demanded results, demanded retribution, but Tywin's measured voice declared that there must be patience. Tyrion, standing near a marble pillar, knew that his father's patience was not infinite. There would be a scapegoat or a genuine culprit soon enough. The lion always roars eventually. For Tyrion, the next few weeks were a nervous lull. On one hand, he was free, unshackled by any formal accusation. Yet the city was a tinderbox, and the entire realm felt the quake of Joffrey's death. Envoys from Dorne arrived under heavy guard, seemingly uncertain whether to treat with a child king or a grieving queen. The Tyrell bannermen kept a close watch on the roads, looking for any sign of sabotage or blame from the Lannisters. Far beyond the city's walls, word spread of the dead king, and rumors told of fresh skirmishes in the Riverlands. Sansa found herself the subject of hushed sympathies, for it was widely known how Joffrey had tormented her. But sympathy is dangerous in King's Landing, and soon enough, some courtiers started to whisper that maybe she had conspired to end the monstrous reign of the Boy King, perhaps in league with her cunning husband. Tyrion had to dissuade her from fleeing the castle in a panic. If she vanished now, the crown would have reason to suspect her. He urged patience, counseling that as long as she held her head high, the court's suspicions would remain scattered. Another suspect might rise to take her place in the rumor mills soon enough. The best path, he advised, was to continue her polite, distant presence in the Red Keep, continuing as if nothing had changed, though everything had irrevocably. One evening, while candlelight flickered across the high walls of Tyrion's solar, he received an unexpected visitor, Jaime. Dressed in his polished armor, the Kingslayer stepped inside, casting a long shadow. Gone were the days of his confident swagger. The loss of his hand had changed Jaime irrevocably, though Tyrion still recognized the golden-haired pride that lingered in his brother's eyes. Jaime's voice was hushed. He told Tyrion that Cersei was consumed by fury and grief, her nights spent pacing, her days spent pressing Tywin for swift justice. According to Jaime, their sister's prime suspect was Margaery Tyrell. The Queen Mother believed the Tyrells had planned this from the start, orchestrating Joffrey's end to pave an easier path for Margaery to manipulate a more pliable boy-king like Tommen. Tyrion listened, swirling wine in his cup. He knew that Margaery was cunning, but she was not cruel. If she had truly wanted Joffrey gone, she would have found subtler ways, though perhaps subtlety was exactly what poison was. Nevertheless, Tyrion's thoughts wandered to the possibility that Littlefinger and Olenna had conspired, as he had once suspected in another timeline of chance. Yet here he was, safe from blame at least for now. Jaime's visit ended with a quiet warning. If Cersei found any sign that could implicate Tyrion, she would not hesitate to use it. Family bonds be damned. She wanted blood for her lost son. As Jaime departed, Tyrion sat alone, the wine turning bitter on his tongue. He did not relish Joffrey's death. He had hated the boy's cruelty, but there was little joy in seeing another mortal succumb to such a vile end. Yet he could not help the sense of relief that, in this twisted version of events, Cersei had not pointed her dagger of accusation at him. The Red Keep's corridors were seldom quiet in the aftermath. Tyrion spent his days carefully maintaining his role as master of coin, ensuring the crown's financial matters did not collapse in the midst of the turmoil. He met with bankers from Braavos, with spice traders from Essos, with goldsmiths from Casterly Rock who still responded to Tywin's every beck and call. While the city simmered with fear, the wheels of governance continued to turn. Through it all, Tyrion kept his ear to the ground. He heard from Varys that Cersei had ordered private investigations into every maid who had served Joffrey's wedding feast. Pycelle had been scolded more harshly than ever, forced to analyze every morsel of leftover food for toxins. The Tyrells had refused to be cowed, maintaining a delicate defiance by continuing to shower Tommen with gifts and attention as if to prove they were loyal to the new king. Tommen himself seemed frightened by the swirl of politics around him. He was a gentle boy vastly different from his cruel brother. Tyrion sensed that if the Tyrells did indeed want influence, they would find it easy to steer Tommen with a warm smile and sweet words. Perhaps that was the core of Cersei's dread, that her power would vanish under the sway of the Tyrell matriarch. Tyrion knew that fear would keep her vigilant, looking for conspiracies in every corner, longing for a scapegoat on which to unchain her wrath. And so he tread carefully, offering no reason for suspicion to fall upon him. Yet no man can entirely control the narrative in King's Landing. One afternoon, a rumor emerged from the depths of Flea Bottom, carried by the tongues of paupers and passed among the fishmongers and bakers until it reached the ears of the Red Keep. It suggested that some shadowy figure had slipped a rare poison known as the Strangler into Joffrey's cup. The rumor further claimed that the coin for the poison had been provided by a highborn lady who harbored a secret hatred for the Lannisters. Only a day later, a ragged drunkard was found floating face down in the Blackwater Rush. Word had it he had boasted too loudly in a tavern about knowing the truth. Varys remarked on this development with an enigmatic shrug, his lips curving into a half-smile that told Tyrion he suspected a deeper, more organized plot than a simple drunken boast. Tyrion pressed the spider for details, but Varys only responded with cryptic musings about how knowledge could be as treacherous as the high seas. Still, the rumor that the poison was the Strangler confirmed Tyrion's own private suspicions. It was a poison he had read about in ancient texts, exotic and deadly, rumored to come from the far side of the Jade Sea. But who had the means and the cunning to use it here, on Joffrey, in front of all the lords and ladies of the realm? Amid the swirl of suspicion, funeral rites took place for Joffrey. The great September of Baelor was clad in black drapery, and the bells tolled solemnly across the city. Lords and ladies gathered, all wearing mourning attire, their faces masks of sorrow or stoicism. Sansa stood with Tyrion, hands clasped, forced to feign a grief for a king who had been her tormentor. Cersei's face was pale, her eyes puffy with tears, but her anger brimmed just beneath the surface. Marjorie displayed all the decorum expected of a widow, though she and Joffrey had not consummated the marriage before his death. The court whispered about whether she was truly queen or if her status died with the king. Olenna Tyrell supported her granddaughter throughout the day, whispering reassurances. Meanwhile, Tywin took on his sternest expression, reminding everyone that the Lannisters were still in control, that the realm would not collapse simply because a tyrant king had passed. Tyrion endured the claustrophobia of the ceremony, watched as the Silent Sisters prepared the body, and observed every flicker of expression across the assembled crowd. He was searching for a crack in someone's mask, some hint that might reveal the murderer's identity. But each face was as guarded as his own. The weight of suspicion burdened them all. When the funeral ended and Joffrey's golden casket was laid to rest, Tyrion returned to his chambers exhausted. He found Sansa seated at the window, staring at the city below. She barely turned when he entered. Their relationship had always been forced, an uneasy arrangement from the moment Tywin decided to marry the Stark girl to his dwarfish son. Yet in the silence of that twilight, Tyrion sensed a kind of camaraderie forming. He poured himself a small glass of wine and offered Sansa a cup of watered wine, but she declined. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. She told him that a part of her felt guilty for not feeling sadness over Joffrey's death, and another part felt terror that someone might decide she was complicit. Tyrion set his cup aside and gently reminded her that in King's Landing, the best armor one can wear is a calm demeanor, a still heart. He told her that if she showed fear or guilt, it would only feed the rumor mill. Sansa nodded, her auburn hair catching the last rays of the dying sun. For a moment, Tyrion thought he saw the faintest quirk of a smile on her lips, a glimmer of relief that she was no longer bound to the monstrous boy king, even if the cost of that freedom was more death and suspicion. Then, as swiftly as it came, the moment passed and she returned her gaze to the sprawling city as if searching for a future beyond the Red Keep. Days rolled into weeks, and still no definitive culprit was found. Tyrion continued his duties, meeting with the Iron Bank's representatives, ensuring the crown's debts were managed. He heard from Varys that Cersei was pushing Tywin to accuse the Tyrells outright. She believed they had orchestrated the murder to install Marjorie as queen to Tommen, thus wielding influence over a malleable child. Tywin, ever the politician, resisted Cersei's demands, as he worried about fracturing the alliance with the Tyrells and losing their crucial support and food supplies. The realm needed the Reach's harvests, especially with winter looming on the horizon. Tyrion suspected that, in truth, Tywin might also suspect the Tyrells, but he could not afford to lash out at them without absolute certainty. Meanwhile, Tyrion received no fewer than 3 ominous letters from unknown senders, each warning that eventually, the truth would surface. Some threatened to brand him as a traitor if he did not pay coin. Others demanded unspecified favors. Tyrion burned each letter by candlelight, refusing to let blackmailers dictate his life. He sensed that, by slipping through the noose of suspicion, he had inadvertently become a target for extortion. And so, he went on guard, instructing Podrick Payne to double-check visitors to their chambers and taking care not to wander the city unprotected. As the tension escalated, Tyrion realized he had not had a private word with his father since the day of the wedding. Tywin's presence was a looming force behind every corridor, every guard station, every council meeting. If there was any man in the 7 kingdoms who would not rest until the murderer was found, it was Tywin Lannister. Tyrion requested an audience, though he half expected to be rebuffed. To his surprise, Tywin agreed, summoning him to the Solar that evening. Tyrion entered to find his father seated at a massive oaken desk, scanning a series of letters. Candles lit Tywin's stern face, casting deep shadows under his eyes. He looked older than Tyrion remembered, the lines of worry and anger deeply etched into his skin, though he still possessed that regal posture that marked him as the Lion of Casterly Rock. Tywin did not ask Tyrion to sit. He merely gestured at a chair. They spoke in low tones abo. The inquiry about Tommen's coronation, about the need for stability in the realm. Tyrion held his breath, waiting for a sign that Tywin suspected him or perhaps was testing him. But the old lion did not pounce. Instead, he confided that the crown's finances were in a precarious state. The wars had drained the treasury more than expected. Tywin needed to secure support from the Tyrells to avoid famine. That meant forging new treaties, alliances, and perhaps some form of reparation for Joffrey's death if indeed the Tyrells were responsible. Tyrion saw the trap in his father's words: if the Tyrells were innocent, pressing them too hard could drive them away. If they were guilty, letting them slip by unpunished would be a staggering humiliation for the Lannisters. Tywin, for once, seemed torn between his typical decisive approach and the constraints of realpolitik. Tyrion offered carefully measured words, suggesting that the best path was to fortify the alliance with caution while privately investigating alternative suspects. Tywin's only response was a curt nod. In that silent moment, Tyrion understood that his father valued his counsel more than he let on. Yet no warmth existed between them. It was merely a strategic alignment, father and son united for the sake of Lannister power. Meanwhile, the city demanded a new coronation for King Tommen. The Great September of Baelor was readied once more, this time for a more hopeful ceremony. Tommen was presented before the High Septon, who placed a crown upon his blond head. The boy king trembled slightly, but the crowd was eager for a more peaceable ruler than Joffrey. Margaery stood nearby, wearing the gold and green of House Tyrell, offering a radiant smile that eased the tension of the occasion. Even Cersei wore a mask of pleasant composure, though Tyrion could see the flicker of discomfort in her eyes as she watched Margaery place a gentle hand on Tommen's shoulder. The ceremony was grand and orchestrated to radiate an image of stability. It was a reminder that the crown endures, that no single king's death could break the realm. Yet in the corners of the September, among the throng of courtiers, Tyrion heard the murmurs: who killed Joffrey? And will they strike again? The unspoken questions reverberated as each hour passed, but the ceremony continued without incident. When the High Septon declared Tommen the rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, the applause felt forced, tentative, as if all present understood that something was still rotten in the heart of King's Landing. In the subsequent days, Tyrion's life became an exercise in balancing the precarious politics of the realm. He attended small council meetings where Tywin and Olenna Tyrell exchanged thinly veiled barbs about the tragedy of Joffrey's sudden demise. He soothed Sansa's anxieties when she worried about receiving a letter from her aunt in the Vale or from any of her scattered family. He maintained contact with Varys, who continued to spin webs of information throughout the city. And always, Tyrion kept a vigilant eye on Cersei. She grew more withdrawn, more prone to outbursts of anger at the slightest provocation. Once Tyrion found her berating a servant for forgetting to place lemon in her tea, an oversight that should have warranted a mild scolding at most. Instead, she reduced the girl to tears, nearly ordering her flogged until Jaime intervened. Tyrion witnessed that confrontation from a distance, noticing that Jaime tried to calm Cersei, to remind her that cruelty would not bring Joffrey back. Cersei had no comfort in her brother's words, and Tyrion wondered if her grief would morph into a madness that might yet lead to a dangerous accusation. He had to remain cautious. Cersei's wrath was like a smoldering ember hidden beneath the ash, ready to flare at the slightest gust. Tom slipped onward, and soon the Crownlands found themselves beset by new troubles. A band of outlaws, calling themselves the Black Vipers, began terrorizing merchant caravans on the Rose Road. Rumor had it they were loyalists of Stannis Baratheon or perhaps mercenaries from across the Narrow Sea. Regardless of their true allegiance, they robbed shipments of grain and gold, undermining the fragile stability of Tommen's reign. Tywin dispatched a retinue of Lannister men to deal with them, but the outlaws were elusive, vanishing into the forests whenever soldiers approached. Tyrion found it both ironic and alarming that while the realm fixated on Joffrey's murderer, more pressing threats were emerging beyond the city gates. He tried to raise the issue at a small council meeting, urging the crown to coordinate with House Tyrell's forces to protect the Rose Road, but Cersei cut him off sharply. She claimed that the main priority was rooting out the regicide conspirators, not chasing brigands through the countryside. Margaery, who was present in her capacity as queen-to-be, subtly supported Tyrion's view, pointing out that the outlaws endangered supplies for the city. But Cersei bristled at the alliance between Tyrion and Margaery. When Tywin declared they would form a joint task force, Cersei's lips tightened, though she did not openly contradict him. Tyrion sensed another ripple of tension passing between mother and daughter-in-law. If the Tyrells had orchestrated Joffrey's death, they were playing a long, delicate game, one that required them to remain close to the seat of power without drawing lethal suspicion. Nights found Tyrion restless, wandering the stone corridors, occasionally checking the black waters of the bay from the castle ramparts. At times, he thought about his lost love, Shae, and the way she had drifted from his life. In this altered path, she had left King's Landing before the wedding. He had arranged for her safe passage, wanting to protect her from the serpentine intrigues of the court. Now he found himself alone in a marriage that felt more like a truce than a bond, and he wondered if he would ever find genuine peace in these halls. Tyrion's greatest solace was perhaps the library, where he could lose himself in dusty tomes about the histories of the realm. Late into the night, he would read tales of Targaryen rule, of the Blackfire rebellions, of the cunning plots that shaped the destinies of kings. He recognized that same cunning in the labyrinth of suspicion surrounding Joffrey's death. Someone had orchestrated a perfect murder in broad daylight before the mightiest lords of the land and had thus far escaped unscathed. That took audacity, planning, and a willingness to play the game with deadly stakes. Tyrion felt a perverse admiration for the perpetrator, for he knew how difficult it was to survive in King's Landing, let alone commit such a brazen act without immediate reprisal. Meanwhile, whispers grew that the bastard daughter of Oberyn Martell, Illyria Sand, had arrived in the city to demand answers about the political environment her lover had stepped into. Though Oberyn was yet alive and had his own reasons to be in King's Landing, Dorne's stance was uncertain. Tyrion heard that Dorne wanted vengeance for past Lannister atrocities. Oberyn was rumored to still hold Tywin responsible for Elia Martell's death years ago. With Joffrey now dead, the Martells might find new leverage. The climate of suspicion broadened beyond the Tyrells, as some rumored Dorne might have sought to weaken the Lannisters by assassinating Joffrey. Tyrion dismissed that as a possibility. Oberyn was more direct in his approach, preferring open duels and frank confrontation. Poison might be the weapon of choice in Dorne, but not in such a public manner unless Oberyn wanted to flaunt it. No, Tyrion sensed that if Oberyn had struck, he would have reveled in announcing it. His style was flamboyant, not secretive. So that too became a dead end in Tyrion's mental quest for truth. Months passed, and the monarchy of Tommen Baratheon settled into a cautious rhythm. Margaery officially wed the Boy King in another ceremony, this one smaller and more subdued than the grand affair that ended in tragedy. No large feasts were held this time. Tywin insisted on a modest gathering for safety and for the realm's finances. Tommen seemed quietly happy with Margaery, who treated him with kindness. In her new role, Margaery began to host charitable events for the city's poor, distributing bread and clothing. This won her favor among the small folk, who started calling her the Little Rose in hushed tones. Cersei loathed every moment of it, for each act of charity chipped away at her own influence. Tyrion watched from the sidelines, focusing on how these developments might strengthen the crown's grip on power. Yet the question of Joffrey's killer remained a gaping wound in the city's collective psyche. Tywin's investigation continued in hushed corridors and behind closed doors. Tyrion sometimes wondered if Littlefinger had orchestrated everything before slipping away to the Vale, or if Olenna Tyrell had wielded her subtlety to remove a dangerous obstacle to Margaery's future. As time progressed, suspicion that Tyrion had any direct role faded into the background. He found that ironically unsettling. In King's Landing, sometimes innocence was more suspicious than guilt. Then, one night, Tyrion was summoned to a clandestine meeting in the bowels of the Red Keep. A young page with terrified eyes delivered the note, claiming it was from someone who knew the truth of Joffrey's demise. The message instructed Tyrion to come alone, warning that if he brought guards, the contact would vanish like mist. Tyrion debated ignoring the summons, but curiosity gnawed at him. What if this was the break in the case that could finally unravel the murder? He left Podrick behind, venturing into the dark corridors until he reached a deserted storeroom near the dungeons. There, hooded in a thin cloak, he found a woman trembling with fear. She claimed to be a kitchen servant who had glimpsed Lord Baelish whispering with Lady Olenna Tyrell before the wedding feast. In hushed, frantic tones, she insisted that she had overheard snatches of conversation about the right vintage, about ensuring it's done before the bedding ceremony. She believed they had conspired to slip poison into Joffrey's cup. Tyrion asked why she had not gone to Tywin or the City Watch with this information. The servant claimed she had tried to speak to a guard, but soon afterward someone threatened her, cautioning her to keep silent if she valued her life. Now, with her courage failing, she turned to Tyrion, hoping the dwarf might protect her in exchange for the truth. Tyrion felt a chill crawl up his spine. Peter Baelish was already gone from the city, having left abruptly after the wedding. Olenna Tyrell had returned to Highgarden for a time, citing her advanced age and health. The pair had parted ways, at least publicly. Yet here was a servant who swore to have witnessed their collusion. Tyrion probed for details. Was she sure it was Baelish? Could she recall the exact words? The woman's memory was hazy, but the gist remained clear, something about a crystal flask, about making sure the poison was available and not discovered by the king's tasters. It matched the rumor of the strangler. Tyrion felt a knot form in his gut. Littlefinger's cunning was legendary, and Olenna Tyrell's devotion to Margaery's well-being was absolute. Together, they might indeed have orchestrated the perfect crime, pinning suspicion on a dozen different suspects, leaving the actual conspirators free of blame. If true, what did Tyrion do with this knowledge? Confronting Olenna Tyrell would risk the alliance with House Tyrell, and Tywin would not proceed without certain proof. Petyr Baelish was beyond the city's reach for now, perched in the Vale. Should Tyrion deliver the servant to Tywin's investigation? Or should he hide this knowledge, knowing that an open accusation could ignite a war between Lannister and Tyrell? Caught between the jaws of politics, Tyrion promised the servant that he would ensure her safety if she repeated her story to him in greater detail. He gave her a few gold coins, instructing her to lie low until he called upon her. With that, he returned to his chambers, mind a-whirl. This revelation confirmed what he had long suspected, that Joffrey's death was less a random stroke of fortune and more a carefully orchestrated maneuver. But in a kingdom so fragile, the truth could be a blade that cuts in unpredictable ways. Tyrion spent the rest of the night sleepless, pacing, cursing the intricate webs that bound them all to a precarious fate. When morning arrived, Tyrion summoned the courage to speak with Varys, the only man who might offer perspective without immediate bias. In a quiet corner of the royal gardens, he relayed what he had learned. Varys listened with that familiar, placid expression, occasionally batting away a honeybee or adjusting the hem of his voluminous robes. When Tyrion finished, the Master of Whisperers closed his eyes and exhaled softly, as if confirming something he already suspected. He suggested that Tyrion weigh the consequences carefully. Exposing Olenna Tyrell and Littlefinger would indeed clarify the murder, but it would also plunge the realm into renewed chaos. House Tyrell would not take kindly to open accusation, and Baelish's hold in the Vale might grow stronger if he was publicly challenged. Varys noted that sometimes, preserving the peace involved leaving certain truths buried. Tyrion seethed at the moral compromise of it all. But he understood the logic. If the truth sparked war, then Tommen's fledgling reign could crumble. Another round of bloodshed would devour the realm. Tyrion's distaste for hypocrisy warred with his sense of duty. Preserving King's Landing and its people might require turning a blind eye to the murder of a tyrant king. Weeks passed as Tyrion wrestled with this dilemma. He quietly arranged for the servant woman to be given safer lodgings, ensuring no one else knew of her whereabouts. He did not confide in Sansa, fearing she would feel too great a temptation to see Joffrey's killers unveiled. He did not tell Jaime, whose loyalties were already stretched thin between love for Cersei and a sense of honor that still flickered within him. Instead, Tyrion watched the daily workings of the Red Keep, noticing how the tension between Cersei and Margaery escalated. The new queen was taking on more responsibilities, earning Tommen's affection, and endearing herself to the populace with charitable acts. Cersei, overshadowed and increasingly bitter, sought consolation in wine and unspoken hatred. Tywin remained stoic, focusing on matters of state. If he suspected the truth about Joffrey's murder, he did not reveal it. Tyrion recognized the possibility that his father might already know or at least strongly suspect the truth. After all, Tywin's capacity for deduction was formidable. But the old lion might have chosen the same path of silence, preferring to maintain the alliance with the Tyrells rather than tear the realm apart for the sake of avenging a grandson who had been, frankly, a violent embarrassment to the Lannister name. Eventually, fate beckoned Tyrion to make his choice. Late one evening, after the hustle and bustle of court life had calmed, he was summoned once again to Tywin's presence. This time, Jaime stood in the room, along with Pycelle and Ser Marentrant. The tension was palpable as Tyrion entered, searching their faces for signs of accusation. Tywin, seated at his massive oaken desk, fixed Tyrion with a hard stare. On the desk lay a small flask and a folded parchment. Tyrion's heart pounded as he recognized the faint, swirling pattern on the flask. That was the mark of the strangler described in old tomes. Tywin's voice was cold as ice when he spoke. He explained that a certain piece of evidence had come to light, confirming the nature of the poison used on Joffrey. A cask in the Red Keep storeroom had been traced to a ship from the Jade Sea that docked before the wedding. The ledger indicated it was purchased by a certain noble's steward, though the name on the ledger was cleverly forged. Now, Tywin wanted Tyrion's analysis. The old lion locked gazes with his son, as if reading the unspoken knowledge flickering behind Tyrion's eyes. Tyrion felt the weight of that moment. He could either reveal his suspicions about Olenna Tyrell and Littlefinger, igniting a crisis that could tear the realm asunder, or he could feign ignorance, letting the unsolved murder remain a mystery that served the interests of peace. Tyrion chose his words with utmost care. He acknowledged that the poison was likely the strangler, that it had come from distant shores, and that forging ledgers was a typical move for the cunning among the nobles. He speculated that the murderer had planned this well, intending to remain hidden behind layers of deceit. Tywin nodded slowly, but his expression was inscrutable. Jaime shifted uncomfortably. Pycelle wrung his hands and muttered something about how the ancient scrolls documented the strangler's unique properties. Ser Meryn remained silent and still, more statue than man. Finally, Tywin folded the parchment, set it aside, and dismissed them all except Tyrion. When they were alone, the hand of the king spoke in a low, measured tone. He said that although the official inquiry had yielded no culprit, he had his own private theory. Tyrion listened, his face carefully neutral. Tywin did not name names, but he implied that powerful figures had orchestrated Joffrey's demise. He suggested that justice could be pursued, but at the cost of plunging the realm into chaos. As he spoke, Tyrion realized the question in his father's eyes. Was Tyrion going to say anything? Would Tyrion confirm or deny a hidden plot involving key allies of the crown? In that moment, Tyrion saw the reality of what it meant to preserve power. Joffrey's murder had actually strengthened the Lannister grip on the throne, for Tommen was a more agreeable figure. The Tyrell alliance was still intact. The realm was not at war, at least, not openly. To expose the truth now would unravel so many threads that Tywin had painstakingly woven together. Perhaps the father he had once hated was, in his own ruthless way, ensuring the best outcome for House Lannister and the entire kingdom. Tyrion hated the moral contortions, yet he also saw how these manipulations spared the lives of thousands from a renewed war. So he bowed his head and told Tywin that some truths are better left unspoken in the service of the crown. Tywin regarded him with an inscrutable look, then dismissed him without further comment. From that day forward, the investigation into Joffrey's murder gradually faded from public discourse. The city moved on, albeit with a faint scar etched into its collective memory. Tommen's reign blossomed under Marjorie's guidance, with Cersei's hostility simmering but kept in check by Tywin's iron will. The roads were cleared of outlaws with the combined efforts of Lannister and Tyrell troops. Trade resumed, and though the kingdom remained burdened by debts, the immediate crisis passed. Tyrion continued as master of coin, skillfully managing the finances in a way that pleased the Iron Bank and stabilized the currency. For Sansa, life became a quiet endurance. She remained Tyrion's wife in name, though they had little in common beyond shared survival. Over time, he negotiated with Tywin to allow Sansa some degree of freedom, an arrangement that might one day see her return to the north if the politics shifted favorably. She was no longer the hostage of a cruel king, but neither was she free to roam wherever she pleased. The court gossiped about her fate, but interest in her waned as new scandals and intrigues inevitably rose to the fore. On a personal level, Tyrion found a modicum of peace he had never expected to taste in the capital. His daily tasks occupied his mind, giving him purpose. He still faced sneers from courtiers who saw only the imp, but his position in the small council granted him leverage that few dared challenge openly. Jaime occasionally visited, though the brothers' bond remained tinged with the regret and pain of shared family history. Cersei avoided Tyrion except when forced into joint appearances, her resentment a smoldering brand she could not extinguish. Tywin showed subtle signs of respect for Tyrion's competence, though fatherly affection never manifested. It was an uneasy truce. They cooperated in the realm's governance while leaving old wounds unhealed. Sometimes Tyrion would gaze into a mirror and wonder if this was truly better than the alternative, fleeing the city in disgrace or rotting in a dungeon under false accusation. If he had been accused of killing Joffrey, his life would have likely ended on the scaffold or in the black cells. This outcome, though compromised, at least allowed him to breathe free air and orchestrate a more stable future for the Seven Kingdoms. As time wore on, news from the wider world drifted into King's Landing. Word came of strange developments across the narrow sea, a queen with dragons building an empire. Reports of wildlings in the north, stirring as if preparing for some monstrous threat. The realm was vast, and the capital's petty intrigues were but one small corner of a grand tapestry that stretched across continents. Tyrion found himself fascinated by these rumors of Daenerys Targaryen. He read accounts of the Unsullied, of the liberation of slaves in distant cities like Yunkai and Meereen. Sometimes, late at night, he would wonder what it might be like to sail east, to see the wonders of Essos, to discover a life unchained from Lannister politics. But that was little more than a dream. He belonged here, in the labyrinth of King's Landing, playing the Game of Thrones for a house that grudgingly accepted his usefulness even if it scorned his stature. Still, the memory of Joffrey's choking face haunted him. He would wake sometimes from a dream where he saw the king's eyes bulge, the spittle flecking his lips, the sputtering cough that ended in darkness. In that dream, Joffrey would turn and point an accusing finger at Tyrion, but no words would come. Yet, in reality, the blame had never firmly landed on him. Instead, he was left with a secret knowledge that the conspirators had done the realm an unintended favor. Joffrey had been a rabid dog, one who would have continued to sow terror. The city breathed easier under Tommen's rule. Children no longer feared the hiss of the royal crossbow, and minor lords did not tremble at the prospect of the king's sadistic whims. It was a twisted brand of justice, one gained through poison and shadowy machinations. Tyrion did not condone it, yet he could not entirely condemn it either. Such was the complexity of this new reality. Occasionally, Tyrion received coded notes from the servant woman who had come to him with the key to the truth. He continued to ensure her safety, sometimes arranging for extra coin or for a discreet place she could stay. She asked him once if he would ever reveal what she had told him. He responded in his next message that sometimes secrets were better kept for the good of the realm. He was not sure if that was a lie or a rationalization, but it was the best he could offer. He hoped that her silence would ensure she lived a life free from the deadly consequences of Baelish or Olenna Tyrell's wrath. He hoped she might find a place outside King's Landing, perhaps a small farm or a quiet village, far from the eyes of lords and ladies. Whether she did or not was a mystery that Tyrion did not press to solve. Years later, the official histories of the realm would record King Joffrey's death as a tragedy that cast a shadow over a great wedding feast. They would mention attempts to find the culprit but would conclude that the murderer was never definitively uncovered. Conspiracy theories would persist, naming the Tyrells, the Martells, the Imp, or even foreign agents. Bards would sing songs about the Purple Wedding, weaving half-truths and slander into sensational ballads. Over time, the city moved on to new obsessions, new alliances, new wars. The intricate puzzle of Joffrey's poisoning was gradually overshadowed by greater events that shaped the fate of Westeros. Through it all, Tyrion Lannister remained a figure of both scorn and grudging admiration, a dwarf who had navigated the rapids of royal politics and somehow stayed afloat. When Tyrion stood at the docks one brisk morning, watching a Braavosi ship set sail for Pentos, he felt a pang of longing. He was on the cusp of middle age now, his hair showing faint wisps of silver when the sun caught it. Podrick stood at his side, carrying documents that needed signing. The day's duties called him back to the Red Keep, where budgets and building projects awaited his scrutiny. He lingered just a moment longer, letting the sea breeze caress his face. He thought about the road not taken, the trial that never came, the cell that never imprisoned him, the father who never cast him aside for murdering a nephew. Life was not perfect, far from it. But if that single moment at the wedding had been different, if Cersei had pointed at him in her rage, if the hall had turned on him in that instant, he might be but a dark memory in the pages of Lannister history. Instead, he lived, forging new paths, influencing the course of the kingdom from behind the scenes. Fate had spared him the gallows, granting him the uneasy freedom to maneuver in a realm that thrived on secrets and shadows. And so he returned to the Red Keep, wearing the mantle of a Lannister who was neither hero nor villain, but something far more complicated. A man who had skirted the edge of disaster through no grand design of his own, carried instead by the shifting winds of rumor and suspicion. A man who might, in quiet corners of the night, admit to himself that Joffrey's murder had removed a terrible blight from the realm, but at the cost of plunging him into an even deeper labyrinth of unspoken truths and moral compromise. When he passed the throne room, he glanced up at the Iron Throne, remembering how the realm once cowered before Joffrey's sadistic grin. Now a mild boy-king sat upon it, guided by a queen whose cunning might yet reshape the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion felt a flicker of gratitude that his name had been spared from a false accusation. Still, his soul was not entirely at peace. In King's Landing, peace was a fleeting luxury overshadowed by an endless dance of alliances and vendettas. With each passing day, Tyrion continued to play his part with measured precision, using his wits to shield Sansa from undue harm, guiding Tommen's financial policies, and warding off the subtle slights from courtiers who saw only his stature, not his intellect. The ghost of Joffrey's demise lingered in the rafters of the Red Keep, a reminder that power often shifts not through open battle but through poison in a jeweled cup. And somewhere far away, Peter Baelish likely smirked from the veil, content that his plan had gone unnoticed. Olenna Tyrell might have sipped her tea in Highgarden, satisfied that her granddaughter would not suffer under the cruelty of a monstrous king. All the while, Tyrion Lannister remained in the city, weaving an uneasy tapestry of alliances, illusions, and subdued truths. He was, in some ways, the true survivor of that fateful feast, a dwarf who dodged the noose not by might or manipulation but by the quiet, inexplicable grace of fate itself. Yet fate is not kind or benevolent, it simply is. Over the years, further tremors would shake the foundations of Westeros. Forces from the north, dragons from the east, rebellions, and shifting allegiances would test the reign of House Lannister. But one thing remained clear: the moment that had once sealed Tyrion's doom in another turning of the wheel, his accusation for a murder he did not commit, never happened. Instead, he walked the halls of the Red Keep, still balancing politics and finances, still offering sly quips at council meetings, still bearing the name Lannister with a mixture of pride and shame. At times, he caught his reflection in polished steel and thought he saw the flicker of a shadow behind him, the specter of what could have been. That shape, that lost possibility of a man wrongfully accused, haunted him as a reminder of how fragile destiny truly was. And so, day after day, Tyrion embraced the precarious gift of survival, determined to shape a future that, if not free of the stains of his family's legacy, might at least be less cruel than the past. He might never be a beloved hero, never ride a white steed into the city to thunderous applause, but he knew that even a small man can cast a large shadow if only he stands in the right light. In the end, that was enough to keep him pressing forward. And so life continued in a realm where truth was seldom spoken aloud and justice rarely came without a heavy price. Yet Tyrion Lannister remained steadfast, guided by a flicker of conscience and a hard-won wisdom that told him, in this perilous game, surviving unaccused might just be its own kind of victory. Tyrion Lannister found a measure of routine in the months and years that trailed behind King Joffrey's funeral. The court pressed ever forward, alive with fresh intrigues and alliances, each new scandal pushing the memory of that brutal choking further toward legend. Yet Tyrion never forgot the scalding panic of that day, nor the sense that fate itself had nudged him just out of the gallows' reach. He carried the knowledge like a hidden brand on his chest, a reminder that in the swirl of King's Landing politics, a single twist of rumor could have meant his execution. Now, however, he remained master of coin under Tommen's reign, the small folk whispering with relief that the new king's gentler nature might bring respite from the cruelty of his predecessor. Not every subject openly praised the boy king, but the difference in atmosphere was undeniable. Where once the city lurched under Joffrey's tantrums, it now ambled with a cautious sense that perhaps the worst had passed. Tommen himself began to settle more comfortably upon the Iron Throne, with Margaery Tyrell at his side as queen. She still performed her charitable acts, distributing loaves of fresh bread to the starving, handing out warm cloaks before the first frosts of winter arrived. The small folk adored her all the more for it. Cersei's frustrations only grew, watching the queen win hearts that once belonged, if not to her, at least to the weight of the crown she wore as regent and mother of the king. Tyrion continued to observe from the sidelines, assisting in financial matters, ensuring that the coin needed to keep the city running was not squandered on lavish festivities. Indeed, Tywin had tightened the royal purse, reinforcing the notion that House Lannister's wealth was formidable but not infinite. While trade with the free cities increased, so too did the crown's debts, a precarious situation that left Tyrion in endless negotiations with Braavosi envoys whose smiles concealed a predatory hunger for repayment. Although much of Tyrion's energy was consumed by ledgers and agreements, the question of Joffrey's real murderer persisted in the quiet corners of his mind. He occasionally spotted the kitchen servant he had sheltered, the trembling girl who had claimed to overhear Lord Baelish and Olenna Tyrell conspiring on the wedding day. She was still too frightened to seek a public audience with Tywin, and Tyrion dared not push her further. Quietly, he provided for her housing and made sure no one harassed her. Whenever their eyes met across a courtyard or corridor, she bowed her head. He would give the slightest incline of his own. Neither spoke, but the shared secret hung in the air between them. It was like a dagger sheathed behind his back, always there, never used, a possibility of violence if ever revealed. Life at court ebbed and flowed with the changing seasons. In time, Margaery's family made a point of journeying between Highgarden and King's Landing, exchanging honeyed compliments with Cersei but always leaving behind a faint tension that never quite dissipated. Olenna Tyrell was as sharp-tongued as ever when she visited. Tyrion would watch her conversing with Tywin, thinking how easily she had once slipped a lethal morsel, perhaps a crystal of strangler or something hidden in a gem, into Joffrey's cup. They might speak politely of harvest tallies or the best route to transport grain, all the while Tywin's steely gaze locked with Olenna's sardonic eyes. Neither outright named the other a murderer, but the unspoken air between them was enough to prick at Tyrion's nerves. He suspected Tywin knew or, at the very least, believed Olenna complicit. And it was equally likely Olenna knew that Tywin suspected. Yet for reasons of alliance, for the sake of the throne, both parties let the matter lie. Tyrion imagined the gods themselves might smirk at the spectacle, for if ever two people loathed letting grudges go unavenged, it was Tywin Lannister and Olenna Tyrell. Yet the realm's stability demanded compromise. Jaime, too, was a changed man since returning to the city without his right hand. He wore a golden prosthetic in its place, an ornate piece that occasionally caught the candlelight during feasts and dazzled anyone who stared too long. Despite the glimmering facade, Tyrion could see the torment beneath his brother's bravado. Jaime had never learned to fight well left-handed. He practiced often with Bronn or other skilled swordsmen, but the ephemeral confidence that once defined the Kingslayer had worn thin. Yet in a strange way, this softened Jaime toward Tyrion. They had never been close in the sense of sharing deep confidences. Cersei was Jaime's twin and, for better or worse, his anchor. But the loss of his hand had made Jaime more thoughtful, more appreciative of small mercies. At odd hours, he would occasionally show up at Tyrion's solar with a bottle of Arbor Gold, intending to share a drink. Usually he arrived with a mild scowl, as if uncertain why he had come. Then he would linger for an hour, discussing gossip from the training yard or the day's politics, sipping wine, and frequently flexing the fingers of his remaining hand as if to remind himself it was still there. Tyrion would listen, sometimes offering a sarcastic comment or a subtle jab, but mostly letting Jaime speak. Little by little, the older brother's facade of swagger peeled away, revealing the flicker of a man who might have regrets, about Cersei, about their father's iron rule, about the horrors that had unfolded in the war. The conversation never turned to Joffrey or the question of who was truly responsible for his death, and Tyrion sensed that was for the best. Jaime carried too many burdens already, and if he suspected the Tyrells, it would only ignite a fury that might lead nowhere good. As the seasons shifted, King's Landing experienced a brittle winter that did not quite turn the city to ice but brought enough chill to keep braziers burning round the clock. The monarchy sought to ensure that grain flowed in from the Reach, that shipments of fish from the coasts were not plundered by outlaws, that unrest in the riverlands did not balloon into rebellion. Throughout that time, Tyrion worked behind the scenes, forging compromises and cutting deals, often overshadowed by Tywin's official edicts but not unappreciated by those who recognized the master of coin's diligence. Podrick Payne, Tyrion's loyal squire, matured in these years as well, taking on more responsibilities. He was no longer quite so wide-eyed, though still earnest to a fault. Tyrion would sometimes trust Pod with sensitive errands. On one such errand, involving a coded ledger from the Iron Bank, Pod nearly encountered a group of rough-tempered hedge knights in a tavern. The boy's anxious recounting of the event made Tyrion smile, but he was proud to see that Pod had retained the documents, even if it meant hiding under a stable's haystack until the knights were too drunk to notice him. He was a good lad, the closest thing to a friend Tyrion had in the city aside from Bronn, who drifted in and out of the Red Keep whenever his cell's-word instincts urged him to scrounge for a new venture. Meanwhile, Sansa Stark, still nominally Tyrion's wife, lived in a strange limbo. With Joffrey dead, her immediate torment ended, yet she remained a political pawn. She resided in separate quarters from Tyrion, for despite the marriage, they had never consummated it, and Tyrion had refrained from pressing the issue. In the quiet space of the library, or passing through corridors, they sometimes exchanged small talk, though Sansa's polite reserve rarely cracked. She seemed older than her years, no longer the naive girl who dreamed of knights and princes. Tyrion did what he could to shield her from Cersei's barbs, but since Joffrey's demise, Cersei had discovered new targets for her bitterness, Margaery chiefly, as well as any who dared speak well of the Tyrells. Sansa mostly slipped beneath Cersei's attention. During official functions, she would stand like a statue, offering a courteous smile and kind words, never stepping outside her carefully measured role. Tyrion suspected she was still dreaming of returning to the north, although there was no easy path for a Stark left in King's Landing. The Boltons now held Winterfell in the name of the Iron Throne, and rumors of her younger siblings were scattered across the wind. If Tyrion could have found a safe way to release her from the marriage and send her home, he might have done so, but the political cost was steep. For the moment, Sansa remained a figure of quiet tragedy, wearing courtesy as her armor. Despite, or perhaps because of these unsettled personal bonds, the functioning of the realm proceeded. Tommen was crowned in earnest. Marjorie took on her queenly duties with aplomb, hosting feasts that never quite rivaled the disastrous purple wedding in splendor but offered enough spectacle to keep the courtiers satisfied. The Privy Council, comprising Tywin, Cersei, Mace Tyrell whenever he was in the city, Pycelle, and Varys, continued to wrestle with the question of how to maintain stability, pay off debts, and prevent further rebellions. Tyrion's role grew more significant as Tywin delegated him tasks that required a subtle hand. Negotiating with the Iron Bank, appeasing disgruntled lords, investigating rumors of disloyalty in the Crownlands. Tyrion recognized this as a tacit mark of trust from his father, trust in his capability if not in his moral fiber. Perhaps Tywin saw him as a tool, a craftily honed implement that could whittle away problems while Tywin tended to larger matters. Whatever the reason, Tyrion found himself busier than ever, more deeply entrenched in the city's machinations than he had been even before Joffrey's death. The simmering question of Oberyn Martell and the Martell presence never disappeared either. Oberyn had come to King's Landing originally seeking both vengeance and the chance to champion Dorne's interests. He was a man known for boldness and for the old grudge he bore toward the Lannisters for the horrors that befell Elia Martell during the sack of King's Landing years ago. With Joffrey gone, Oberyn's official reason to remain in the city became tenuous, and yet he lingered as if suspecting that House Lannister might soon give him another opening to air his grievances. Tyrion had encountered Oberyn on a few occasions, exchanging witticisms. SMS that teetered between playful and barbed. The Red Viper's eyes always glimmered with some hidden fire. Once at a lesser feast in the royal hall, Tyrion offered a polite compliment about the Dornish approach to warfare. Oberyn responded with a knowing smile, "We Dornish prefer a more personal approach to settling our disputes. Poison is not always a craven's weapon. But cunning can be a virtue, no?" He said it lightly, swirling wine in his cup, but Tyrion felt a prickle of unease. Oberyn might be referencing the rumors of how Joffrey died, or might simply be rattling the Lannisters' cage. In King's Landing, one never really knew which it was. The sting of that memory lingered for Tyrion even as new troubles arose. Word drifted from the northern borders that the Night's Watch was facing unprecedented threats. Wildlings were on the move, giants rumored to march alongside them, and even more outlandish tales of undead figures roaming icy wastes. Most courtiers dismissed these stories as northern superstition, ghost stories told to children on long winter nights. But there were some who believed them. Davos Seaworth, the loyal hand to Stannis Baratheon, had once tried to rally the realm to defend the Wall. Now, with the memory of the War of the Five Kings still raw, the notion of uniting behind Stannis felt unthinkable to many lords in the capital. Tyrion, for his part, had read enough odd manuscripts to suspect there might be a kernel of truth to the talk of ancient evils stirring. Nevertheless, the priority in King's Landing was preserving the new peace, not chasing mythical threats beyond the Wall. So the rumors remained rumors, half forgotten behind the daily labyrinth of southern politics. Then came a summons that changed Tyrion's carefully balanced life. One gray morning, he was requested in the council chamber at an unusual hour. When he arrived, he found Tywin seated at the head of the table, Cersei to the right, Olenna Tyrell to the left, and Mace Tyrell hovering behind his mother, fidgeting. Pycelle trembled in his seat, while Varys stood near the window, hands folded. A hush cloaked the room, the air taut with tension. No one was smiling. Tyrion took his customary place beside Olenna, trying to read the flicker in her eyes. Tywin's deep voice broke the silence, announcing that new intelligence had reached them concerning Littlefinger's dealings in the Vale. Apparently, Baelish was forging alliances with several minor lords in the region, strengthening his hold on young Lord Robert Arryn. Rumors suggested he might be preparing to declare the Vale's independence, or at least keep its soldiers from responding to any summons from King's Landing. Normally, a single region's defiance might not be cataclysmic, but the Vale's mountainous borders were nearly impregnable, and Baelish possessed cunning that could weave this defiance into a larger conspiracy, one that might threaten Tommen's reign. Tywin demanded suggestions on how to respond. Tyrion knew Baelish's methods too well. Peter Baelish never acted without carefully orchestrating each step. The man had left the city so conveniently after Joffrey's death, taking Sansa's unwitting aunt as a bride, though the official details were murky. He was likely well aware that the capital had no appetite for another war. That gave him leverage. Cersei proposed sending a contingent of Lannister men to the Vale, forcing the lords to submit. Olenna retorted that such a move would be disastrous, for mountainous strongholds do not fall easily, and the Tyrells would not lend men to a war that gained them nothing. Tywin listened with stony composure, his voice carrying an undercurrent of frustration. His plan, it seemed, was to use diplomacy at first, perhaps an offer of a royal marriage or a favorable trade deal. But if Baelish refused, force might be necessary. Mace Tyrell announced that he had no desire to waste his soldiers in the mountains. Cersei accused him of cowardice, which made Mace bristle, and Olenna had to pinch his arm to quiet him. In the midst of this tense exchange, Varys cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. He spoke softly of the Vale's resources, how trade with Gulltown could be critical for shipping grain in future winters, how Baelish might block the route if threatened. He also reminded them that Baelish was a master of secrets. Before leaving King's Landing, he had presumably planted informants across the city. In short, an open confrontation would be more complicated than Tywin's stoic militarism would like to admit. Tyrion recognized an opportunity here. Despite his distaste for Littlefinger's schemes, he understood the man's ambition well enough to sense that direct confrontation would likely fail. But if the crown played to Baelish's hunger for status and riches, they might buy time or keep him in check. Tyrion ventured to suggest that they extend an olive branch, some new privilege or official position that Baelish might covet, binding him more firmly to the throne. This, Tyrion said, would at least keep the Vale's gates open for trade. Tyrion's father listened with a faint narrowing of his eyes, but he did not dismiss the idea outright. Neither did Olenna. And so, after a round of back-and-forth argument, Tywin decided the crown would dispatch an envoy to the Vale, armed with offers of beneficial trade, a promise of expanded autonomy for local lords, and perhaps a gesture of good faith in naming Baelish an official warden of the East if he pledged loyalty to Tommen. It was a gamble, but one that might avert an immediate war. When the meeting ended, Tyrion felt as if he had walked a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Margaery, who had been in an adjacent hall, approached him, thanking him softly for urging caution rather than conflict. War would only bring more widows and orphans, she said, the corners of her mouth tight with concern. Tyrion gave a weary nod. For all her political ambition, Margaery did seem to care about sparing lives, a trait that set her apart from many in King's Landing. Cersei, spotting them speaking together, gave Tyrion a glare sharp enough to pierce steel. But he ignored her and continued speaking to Margaery. For a moment, they were joined by Tommen himself, who had been waiting anxiously outside the council. The Boy King looked up to Tyrion with a glimmer of admiration, asking in a soft voice if Uncle Tyrion really thought Peter Baelish could be reasoned with. Tyrion kneeled to meet Tommen's eyes, telling him that men like Baelish were rarely content without the promise of power or gold. Offer them something tempting enough and they might come to heel, at least for a while. Tommen nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing the complexities of rulership that had so abruptly fallen onto his young shoulders. In the days that followed, Tyrion's life revolved around drafting the official proposal to Baelish. He pored over the kingdom's finances, the Vale's exports, and the genealogies that might hint at a strategic marriage. He even considered the possibility of betrothing one of Mace Tyrell's many cousins to a Vale lord, binding them in that way. The Tyrells were only lukewarm to the idea, so Tyrion had to get creative with trade incentives. All the while, the city carried on with its swirl of daily dramas. Knights jousted in the tourney grounds, gold cloaks patrolled the street in search of petty criminals, and merchants hawked everything from Dornish peppers to Braavosi lace. Life was an endless tapestry of alliances formed and broken before the sun set. Tyrion found an odd sense of belonging in that environment, for it mirrored the unsettled state of his own soul, always juggling, always balancing precariously. Throughout these efforts, Tywin kept a close eye on Tyrion, occasionally sending for him to discuss the progress of negotiations. In those private meetings, the father and son rarely spoke of anything beyond the matter at hand. Yet a subtle tension had lifted, an unspoken acknowledgement that Tyrion had proved his worth more than once. Tywin still did not shower him with praise or fatherly warmth. Tywin Lannister was not built to coddle. But he would sometimes grant Tyrion a curt nod of approval, which, in Tywin's world, was the closest thing to a laurel wreath. Tyrion learned to accept these moments as the intangible currency of the relationship they shared. It was better than open hostility. When the proposal was finally complete, Tyrion handed the sealed parchment to the envoys who would ride for the Vale. "Tell Lord Baelish," he said wryly, "that his old friends in King's Landing await his favorable reply." The envoys, one a tall knight loyal to the crown and the other a slender man rumored to be one of Varys's discreet informants, departed before dawn. As Tyrion stood on the ramparts to watch them pass through the city gates, he wondered what Baelish would demand in return for keeping the Vale loyal. Peter might well accept the crown's offer only to twist it to his advantage. That was the real nature of the game, after all. The best one could hope for was to keep the snakes from biting too quickly by another season of uneasy peace. Tyrion's thoughts turned briefly to Joffrey's death, that pivotal moment when suspicion could have devoured him but did not. He had never quite shaken the feeling that Petyr Baelish had orchestrated the entire murder with Olenna Tyrell's assistance. Now, ironically, Tyrion himself was orchestrating deals to placate Baelish. Perhaps that was the ultimate jest, that the man who had murdered the king, if indeed he was the culprit, should be rewarded with further power. Tyrion could almost hear the gods' laughter echoing in the wind. It was an old lesson. Justice in Westeros was seldom simple or fair. One could rage at the hypocrisy or learn to navigate it. As the envoy vanished into the distance, Tyrion sighed. He felt a faint pang of emptiness in his chest, a sensation he often attributed to losing Shae or to the distance he kept from Sansa. In truth, it was more than that. He was a man forever unmoored in the city, tolerated but never fully embraced, both indispensable and easily reviled. Perhaps that was why he survived. No one truly saw him as a stable piece on the board. All the same, he missed having someone to share his private thoughts with. Varys was an ally of sorts, but the Spider's friendship was built on a shifting foundation of secrets. Jaime was family but had his own entanglements. Sansa was his wife in name only. Bronn was off chasing coin. Tyrion sometimes imagined how different life might have been if Shae had remained loyal, or if he had never brought her to King's Landing at all, sparing her this nest of vipers. But regrets did not change the present. So he turned from the ramparts and returned to his duties, burying himself in the day's demands. Weeks passed, then months. The Vale's response remained elusive, with no official raven returning to the capital. Tywin grew impatient, Cersei openly skeptical, and Olenna Tyrell took to making pointed remarks about how some men prefer to straddle every fence until the wind blows them off. Tyrion sensed that Baelish was likely biding his time, enjoying the knowledge that the Lannisters and Tyrells were left in a state of uncertainty. Meanwhile, developments elsewhere in Westeros drew the court's attention. News arrived from the Iron Islands of renewed raids along the coast. Victarion Greyjoy supposedly set sail with a formidable fleet, while Euron Greyjoy was rumored to have reappeared, bearing strange tidings from beyond the Sunset Sea. In the Stormlands, minor lords jockeyed for position after the region's devastation in the war. Stannis Baratheon, rumored to be at the Wall, sent the occasional raven south, urging the crown to send men to defend against wildlings and the mysterious threats beyond. These letters typically ended up in the small council, where Tywin dismissed them as the ravings of a defeated pretender. Tyrion wasn't entirely certain Tywin was right to dismiss the warnings, but he had learned that challenging his father's strategic priorities brought diminishing returns. Their main focus remained the peace at home, the unity of the crown, and the continuing necessity of Tyrell cooperation. Through it all, Tyrion noticed that Sansa grew increasingly pale. She rarely ventured beyond the Red Keep's walls, and on the few occasions she did, she returned looking tense, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Rumors still circulated that the North might rise again under some hidden Stark heir. Sansa was the key to the North in many ways. Any man who wedded her might claim dominion over Winterfell if he could oust the Boltons. Tyrion could guess that countless suitors across Westeros dreamed of such a match. That put Sansa in danger of abduction, of forced marriage, of manipulative conspiracies. Perhaps that was why she rarely left the keep. She felt safer behind stone walls, even if she detested the city's claustrophobic climate. One chilly evening, Tyrion found her alone in the castle gardens. The trees were half barren, the ground dotted with fallen leaves. She was humming a tune, something faintly reminiscent of northern ballads. When she noticed him, she lowered her gaze, offering a curtsy. He asked if she wished for anything: books, new dresses, a chance to visit the gardens with a guard escort. Her reply was distant but polite. She said she craved the North's crisp air, the sight of snow blanketing a quiet courtyard, the memory of her siblings' laughter echoing through the halls of Winterfell. Tyrion swallowed hard, feeling a pang of sympathy for her loss. He gently reassured her that if the political winds changed, he would do what he could to see her return safely. She managed a wry smile, as though she could not bring herself to believe it. In King's Landing, empty promises were a currency all their own. Still, she thanked him, and for a fleeting moment, Tyrion thought he saw genuine gratitude in her eyes. Then she slipped away, leaving him alone under the skeletal branches of a weirwood transplanted from some distant forest. a tree that looked as out of place in King's Landing as Sansa felt. On another front, Tyrion found himself frequently visited by Bronn, who had used his coin and connections to purchase a small estate outside the city. The Sellsword had grown more ambitious, dressing a bit more finely, wearing a sly grin that said he was enjoying the privileges of a landed knight. Still, Bronn had not lost his edge. Whenever they met, he would remark on the folly of the highborn ways, the duplicity that seemed endless. Tyrion would retort with jokes about how Bronn was now one of those highborn men, knighted, landed, with small folk tenanting his fields. This usually led to a round of coarse banter that helped Tyrion unwind from the tensions of the palace. Bronn offered a brand of honesty that was rarely found in the Red Keep, albeit an honesty tinged with self-interest. Occasionally, Tyrion would dispatch Bronn to handle certain matters discreetly, deterring bandits on the Rose Road, retrieving a satchel of important documents that had fallen into questionable hands, ensuring that certain blackmailers forgot whatever illusions they had about threatening the master of coin. In such errands, Bronn was effective if expensive. Between these tasks and his council duties, Tyrion's days became a blur. He sometimes wondered if the city was sapping his vitality. His hair had begun to show strands of gray, though he was still well shy of his middle years. Perhaps it was the unrelenting stress that salted his locks. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that in King's Landing, no one ever truly rests easy. Whenever he felt that sense of suffocation, he would recall the fateful day of Joffrey's demise, the horror on the boy king's face, the clattering chalice hitting the floor. For all the city's corruption, for all its dark corners, that day had spared Tyrion from a far worse fate. And so he endured, telling himself that survival was its own form of victory. Late one night, as he was finalizing accounts for a new dock expansion at the Blackwater Bay, a knock came at his chamber door. He glanced at Podrick, who opened it warily, then announced that Lord Varys had arrived. The spider glided in, wearing a robe of dusty rose that somehow muted his fleshy frame. He carried a small wooden coffer, which he placed on Tyrion's table. The eunuch's round face was unreadable as ever, though his eyes gleamed in the candlelight. Tyrion dismissed Pod for the moment, inviting Varys to speak. Varys explained that he had received an intriguing report from one of his little birds. Another attempt on Tommen's life might be brewing. The culprit was rumored to be a shadowy figure connected to discontented lords who believed Tommen's claim to the throne was illegitimate. Perhaps supporters of Stannis or even secret adherents of the exiled Targaryen line. They were said to be gathering in secret, forging a plot to poison the young king at an upcoming feast. Tyrion felt a chill. Another royal poisoning? After what had happened to Joffrey, the capital was already on edge. It seemed unbelievable that someone would try the same method again, unless they drew inspiration from the Purple Wedding's success. Varys opened the coffer, revealing a small glass vial half filled with a clear liquid. He claimed it was discovered on a merchant recently detained by the Gold Cloaks. The merchant turned out to be no true merchant but rather a hired courier, possibly working for rebellious lords. Pycelle was analyzing the fluid, though his skill in poisons left something to be desired. Varys wanted Tyrion to know that the court might soon face a second crisis of regicide. The spider added in a whisper that if Tommen died, the realm would likely shatter. The Tyrells might break away, Cersei would be driven mad with vengeance, and any fragile alliances would disintegrate overnight. Tyrion tapped a finger on the table, his mind racing. Was it real or just a rumor to sow chaos? If real, they needed to tighten security around Tommen. If it was false, overreacting could lead to equally disastrous consequences. Varys offered that with his network he could try to entrap the conspirators, catch them in the act. But to do so, he would need Tyrion's help in controlling the Gold Cloaks and ensuring Tywin did not barge in with unsubtle methods. Tyrion found himself in a delicate position. If he told Tywin immediately, the old lion might respond with overwhelming force, possibly trampling potential leads. If the rumor turned out false, it could still spook the Tyrells and cause Margaery to fear for her life. So Tyrion agreed to proceed quietly with Varys, urging the eunuch to gather more evidence before making any move. Varys inclined his head in a gesture of respect, then slipped away, leaving the small vial behind for Tyrion to show Pycelle once the old maester concluded his tests. Tyrion stared at the glimmering liquid, recalling how easily Joffrey had succumbed to poison. He thought of Tommen, that gentle boy, kind to cats and easily flustered by adult conversation. The city's appetite for brutality seemed unending. If another murder took place, especially one that succeeded, the realm might not survive another blow. Over the following days, Tyrion and Varys engaged in a subtle game of cat and mouse, working behind the scenes to identify the rumored assassins. Varys passed on whispered fragments of conversation gleaned from taverns in Flea Bottom, from highborn ladies exchanging secrets over lemon cakes, from scribes forging documents late into the night. Tyrion used his authority as master of coin to trace suspicious monetary transactions, funneling extra coin into bribes for potential informants. Whenever he approached Tywin about minor budgetary maneuvers, he masked the details in bureaucratic language, ensuring that no mention of a possible regicide attempt slipped out too soon. Cersei, meanwhile, noticed nothing unusual. She was too busy pacing with anxiety about Margaery's rising popularity. Jaime still trained in the yard, ignoring the labyrinth of plots that surrounded him, perhaps out of a desire to cling to what little normalcy he had left. Bit by bit, Tyrion and Varys reconstructed a puzzle that led to a cluster of lesser knights and lords who had once backed Renly Baratheon and now apparently nursed a grudge against the Lannister-Tyrell alliance. They were scattered, lacking a true leader, but they had somehow acquired a lethal poison, and a portion of them believed removing Tommen would spark chaos that would allow a new Baratheon claimant, some rumored offspring of Renly or even Gendry, Robert's bastard, to rise. Tyrion wanted to scoff at their naivete, but they were dangerous precisely because they were desperate. In the shadows of King's Landing, desperation could be fatal. Varys arranged for a few trusted gold cloaks to keep watch on these conspirators, letting them think they were unnoticed until they revealed their entire plan. That plan, as it emerged, was as crude as it was bold. They intended to slip poison into Tommen's goblet at a small feast that was to be held in honor of a visiting lord from the Reach. The conspirators had bribed a cupbearer to facilitate the deed. The plan even mirrored the approach used at Joffrey's wedding, as if these fools believed they could replicate what the original plotters had done. Tyrion acted. Under the guise of rearranging the staff, he quietly replaced the cupbearer with a loyal servant from the Red Keep. Simultaneously, he ensured that Pycelle was told to watch for certain symptoms of poisoning in the king's wine. Meanwhile, Bronn and a handful of discreet gold cloaks kept the conspirators under surveillance. The day of the feast arrived, a modest gathering, with Tommen seated on a small dais alongside Margaery and a few visiting lords. Tywin was in attendance, looking as if he suspected nothing, though Tyrion had given him the barest hint that heightened security was needed. Across the hall, Tyrion caught Varys's eye, noting the subtle tilt of his head that said everything was proceeding. The conspirators were scattered among the guests. Tyrion recognized at least two from their descriptions, their faces taut with tension. The new cupbearer performed his duties flawlessly, showing no sign of the subterfuge. When Tommen's cup was poured, Tyrion felt his pulse quicken, remembering the trauma of the last time a king sipped from a poisoned chalice. But this time, the wine was safe. The conspirators seemed confused, exchanging looks. One of them glanced down at his own goblet as if contemplating what to do. That was when Bronn, disguised as a member of the serving staff, signaled the gold cloaks. In a heartbeat, the conspirators were seized, daggers pressed to their throats. Guests gasped, some screamed. Tommen stared wide-eyed. Margaery rose swiftly, her expression one of alarm and confusion. Tywin simply clenched his jaw, eyeing Tyrion. The matter was over almost before it began, a quiet swoop, no chaos. The would-be poisoners were dragged from the hall, their plot undone. In the aftermath, Tywin insisted on a swift trial. Cersei stood by, furious that she had not been informed of every detail. Tyrion braced himself, expecting to see the trials devolve into a fiasco, but the conspirators were too disorganized to mount a defense. Their betrayal was clear. One carried a phial of the same poison discovered earlier, found strapped beneath his vest. Under torture, they confessed to planning the regicide. Tommen was spared the horror of witnessing their confession, but Margaery attended in solemn silence. Tyrion, too, stood by, feeling a mix of relief and revulsion. Relief that Tommen still lived. Revulsion at how casually the city accepted the inevitability of such plots. These men would be executed heads on spikes, perhaps to remind any other fools who might consider the same. And then King's Landing would move on as it always did. After the trial, Tywin summoned Tyrion privately. The Lord of Casterly Rock demanded to know why Tyrion had not revealed his suspicions earlier. Tyrion explained as diplomatically as possible that too much force too soon would have scared the conspirators into hiding, leaving them free to try again later. By letting them think they were unnoticed, Tyrion and Varys had caught them in the act, ensuring they were wholly exposed. Tywin scrutinized his son's face as though searching for a trace of deceit. Then he gave a single curt nod. "You acted wisely," he said, the closest thing to praise Tyrion had ever heard from him. Cersei, however, was another matter. She cornered Tyrion in a corridor, hissing that he had taken reckless risks with her son's life. Tyrion remained calm, pointing out that had they spooked the conspirators, Tommen would remain in danger indefinitely. Cersei's mouth twisted into a sneer. "One day your cunning will be the doom of us all," she spat, turning on her heel. Tyrion could only watch her go, fighting the bitterness that tightened his throat. Joffrey's death had freed him from her direct wrath once, but her hatred smoldered still, always ready to flare if given the slightest justification. In the days that followed, Tommen expressed gratitude for his uncle's efforts, though the boy was still shaken. "I don't understand," Tommen said one morning when Tyrion visited him. "Why do people hate me so much? I've tried to be a good king." Tyrion wanted to say that hatred in the capital was not always personal, it was often just a means to power. But he opted for a gentler explanation. "Sometimes, Your Grace, men hate the crown itself, what it represents, the power it wields. You are the crown, so their hatred falls upon you." Tommen frowned, eyes brimming with confusion. "But how am I to rule when I can't trust anyone?" Tyrion offered a small, sad smile. "Trust those who have proven themselves in deed, not just word. And keep a watchful eye on everyone else." Marjorie, standing behind Tommen, gave Tyrion a grateful nod, as if she, too, understood the weight of such a lesson. Cersei hovered nearby, silent, her face a cold mask. Amid these intrigues, the realm continued to shift. The standoff with Baelish in the Vale finally produced a response, a politely worded letter in which Littlefinger proclaimed his undying loyalty to King Tommen, while simultaneously demanding official recognition of his guardianship over Lord Robert Arryn and the title of Warden of the East. Tywin scowled upon reading the missive. He told Tyrion that acquiescing to Baelish's demands would grant him immense power. But if they refused, Baelish might close the Vale's gates. After several rounds of tense small council discussions, they grudgingly granted Baelish the guardianship and titled him Lord Protector of the Vale, though they stopped short of naming him Warden of the East. The letter that followed from Baelish was coy, accepting the partial concession and indicating that trade would continue through Gull Town. Tyrion could practically hear Baelish's smug laughter beneath the elegant script. Olenna Tyrell, for her part, muttered that the entire arrangement smacked of feeding a fox into the henhouse. But Tywin pointed out that for now it was better to have Baelish placated than openly hostile. Such was the logic that governed King's Landing: keep the known devils close, at least until a chance emerged to leash them more tightly or remove them entirely. Meanwhile, the small folk, blissfully ignorant of many behind-the-scenes plots, found new reasons to fret as winter's chill deepened. Food prices rose, though the Tyrell shipments kept true famine at bay. Chatter among the populace revealed a mixture of relief at Tommen's gentler nature and lingering dread that some new disaster loomed. After all, war and plague had come so often in recent years. Who was to say dragons wouldn't come next? Indeed, rumors of Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen began arriving on ships from Volantis and Pentos. Some said she was the breaker of chains, mother of dragons, building an army to retake the Seven Kingdoms. Others claimed she was an upstart with only a handful of followers and beasts that would not survive the crossing of the narrow sea. Tyrion sometimes listened to these stories from sailors in taverns, curious. He had read enough histories to know the Targaryens were not to be taken lightly, especially if they truly commanded dragons. But convincing Tywin or the small council to worry about a queen half a world away was another matter. The crown was too consumed with immediate concerns. From ensuring the Tyrell alliance to staving off unrest in the Iron Islands to dealing with the simmering tensions in Dorne. Oberyn Martell had returned south for a time, but Dorne's grudges still lingered. Through all this, Tyrion found himself slipping into a day-to-day monotony. He held on to power, maintained alliances, scoured ledgers, and listened to Pycelle drone on at meetings. It was the same endless cycle, occasionally spiked with bursts of danger. Sometimes, in the quiet hours past midnight, when he sipped wine alone in his chambers, he wondered if he truly lived or merely existed in this stasis. The city had a way of trapping souls, binding them to the grindstone of politics until they could no longer imagine life outside its walls. Tyrion felt that entrapment keenly, and yet he stayed both by necessity and by habit. He had no illusions that the Lannisters would let him go gallivanting across the narrow sea to chase curiosity. Nor did he want to vanish while Sansa remained a hostage of sorts, nor while Tommen might still need him. Perhaps that was a sign of loyalty, or perhaps it was the fear that if he left, the entire structure he had built around himself would collapse. Cersei's hostility, meanwhile, simmered on. She made no further moves directly against Tyrion, but he remained wary. He heard from Varys's whispers that she still questioned the circumstances of Joffrey's death, that she sometimes confided in Qyburn, a disgraced maester with a penchant for dark experiments, about ways to root out traitors. But with no evidence linking Tyrion to Joffrey's murder, she could only fester in suspicion. Meanwhile, the Tyrells prospered under Margaery's marriage to Tommen, leading the court to half-jest that it was they, not the Lannisters, who truly ruled. Of course, Tywin would not tolerate such talk. Nonetheless, the Tyrell presence was a powerful force that shaped every policy decision. Gold and grain flowed from the Reach, fueling the city's economy. Tywin recognized that threatening them over a still unsolved murder would be suicidal for the realm's stability. So the uneasy accord endured. One evening, a hush fell over the Red Keep with the arrival of a raven from the north. The dispatch carried news that Winterfell was in ruins after a battle between Bolton men and Ironborn reavers who had once held the castle. The letter spoke of burning towers, of scattered refugees, of a fierce winter wind that howled through the broken gates. Tyrion, reading the report, felt a pang of sympathy for Sansa Stark. Winterfell had been her home, her birthright. Now it was ravaged and empty. He knew it would worsen her silent despair. He also recognized the strategic implications. The North was effectively leaderless, a harsh land with roving pockets of skirmishes. How long before the Crown had to address it? Tywin read the letter as well, sighing with a frustrated air. The Bolton alliance had cost them heavily in gold and blood, and it seemed the Boltons themselves might not be capable of truly securing the region. The small council debated sending a contingent of royal forces to bolster the Boltons, but the logistic costs were enormous and the weather was too unforgiving. So they delayed a decision, as they often did when faced with an unpleasant reality. That night, Tyrion visited Sansa's chambers. He was not in the habit of calling upon her so late, but he felt compelled by a twist of conscience. She answered the door in a plain gown, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on her face. She offered him a puzzled look, then allowed him inside. He told her gently of the news from Winterfell, expecting tears or some outburst. Instead, she merely folded her hands, staring at the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of emotion. "I knew it was gone already. The North is lost to me. Maybe it always was." Tyrion tried to express sympathy, but Sansa's gaze flicked up, a sudden anger flashing in her blue eyes. "You can't understand," she said quietly, her tone wavering between anger and sorrow. "Your home still stands. Your family still rules. Mine is scattered or dead. My castle is a ruin. So many people I knew gone?" Tyrion's throat tightened. He wanted to say that he did understand loss, that his mother had died giving birth to him, that he had always been the outcast of his own family, but he held back. Her grief was different, larger, older. Instead, he bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said softly. Sansa nodded, tears shimmering but not falling. "I know you tried to be kind," she whispered, "but kindness does not rebuild Winterfell." Tyrion couldn't argue with that. He left her chambers with a leaden weight in his chest. Word of Winterfell's destruction soon reached the small folk, fueling rumors of dark omens. Combined with the intensifying cold, these omens filled the city with a subdued dread. Tyrion noticed an uptick in the worship of the Red God among some of the lower classes, flamelit gatherings at night where priests spoke of a war for the dawn. Others clung to the faith of the Seven, lighting candles in the Great September for deliverance. Tywin dismissed such spiritual fervor as irrelevant to governance, but Tyrion sensed the city's underlying fear. They remembered the War of the Five Kings, the bloodshed and starvation. Another wave of conflict could break them entirely. And so, ironically, many turned to the new king with hope. Tommen's gentle face and Margaery's generosity gave them something to cling to, a slender thread of optimism. That, Tyrion thought, might be the greatest irony of Joffrey's murder. By removing the monstrous tyrant, it had opened a door for cautious faith in a more merciful monarchy. The year wore on. Anxieties about the Iron Bank festered as the Crown's debts loomed. Tyrion negotiated a series of smaller repayments that kept the bank's wrath at bay. He found himself in countless meetings, brokering shipping rights, smoothing tensions between petty lords, even drafting trade pacts with Lys and Myr. The city remained a restless beast, never fully tamed. Tyrion found some small comfort in the library, where he would bury himself in old scrolls describing Valyrian history or the intricacies of Lysine architecture. Books offered an escape. But occasionally, when reading about the doomed city of Valyria, he would think about how even the mightiest empires could collapse in a single cataclysm. He wondered if such a fate might someday befall King's Landing. In quieter moments, Tyrion also reflected on how differently his life had turned out from what he once expected. He was no longer that newly arrived dwarf, mocked at court, overshadowed by his father's scorn and Cersei's hatred. He had grown into a force of his own, a political creature who could navigate the labyrinth of the capital with a deftness few could match. Strange how that had arisen from the wedding that ended in royal blood. Had he been accused as he was in another thread of possibility, he'd likely have been executed or forced to flee, never to return. But in this version of events, suspicion never quite took root. He was allowed the space to demonstrate his value. And while the moral quandaries of that day still haunted him, knowing a murder went unpunished, he could not deny that Joffrey's end had spared the realm from far worse torment. If there was cosmic justice, perhaps it had manifested in the form of poison at a wedding feast, even if delivered by those who had their own selfish ends. Occasionally, Tyrion tried to puzzle out exactly how Olenna Tyrell and Petyr Baelish might have orchestrated the murder without implicating themselves. He presumed Baelish had provided the poison. Olenna must have slipped it into Joffrey's cup. If so, what had Olenna's ultimate aim been? Merely to protect Margaery from a sadistic husband? Or was there a broader scheme involving the Tyrell claim to the throne? Baelish's aim seemed clearer: chaos. Chaos was the ladder that allowed him to climb to greater power. Tyrion wondered if, given the chance, Baelish would do the same to Tommen or even Margaery if it served his ends. Possibly so. That was why Tywin had granted him only a fraction of what he wanted in the Vale, to keep him from growing too bold. Yet how long until Baelish saw a chance to strike again, forging new chaos to ascend even higher? Those were the questions swirling in Tyrion's mind when he found himself unexpectedly approached by Jaime on a crisp afternoon. His brother wore his Kingsguard armor, the golden hand shining in the watery sunlight. They walked along the outer walls, listening to the distant clamor of blacksmiths. Jaime's gaze lingered on the horizon. "Father has been discussing potential plans for me," he said after a while. "He wants me to leave the Kingsguard now that there's no war to fight. He'd prefer I manage Casterly Rock or wed some highborn lady to strengthen the family line." Tyrion studied Jaime's profile, noticing how unsettled he looked. "And how do you feel about that?" Jaime exhaled. "Once I might have scoffed. Being a Kingsguard was my life. But now, with his hand, he lifted the golden prosthetic. I'm half the knight I used to be. Or less." Tyrion pursed his lips. "True enough, you can't fight as before. But you could still serve. Tommen needs loyal men around him." Jaime gave a hollow laugh. "Tommen. A sweet boy, but no more than that. We both know father is the real power behind the throne. Margaery might have a share of it as well, in her own way. Where do I fit exactly?" Tyrion recognized the heartbreak in his brother's words, the sense of displacement. Jaime had always defined himself by his skill with the sword, by his membership in the Kingsguard. Now the kings he had sworn to protect were either dead or overshadowed by Tywin's authority. Tyrion said softly, "You could carve your own path, Jaime, if you wanted. You don't have to be a puppet any more than I do." Jaime scoffed. "You think you're not a puppet? We're both dancing on father's strings." Tyrion offered a rueful shrug. "Perhaps. But I'd like to think I at least get to choose the tune once in a while." Jaime snorted, but Tyrion saw the hint of a smile twitch at his lips. They stood there in companionable silence, two brothers battered by the city in their own ways. Before they parted, Jaime laid a hand, his real hand, on Tyrion's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, though Tyrion wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Maybe Jaime was simply grateful for someone who listened without judgment. Tyrion gave a curt nod. Then Jaime turned and strode away, the golden hand glinting in the sun, leaving Tyrion alone with the sound of the wind rustling banners overhead. As the year continued its slow march, one particular event loomed: the anniversary of Joffrey's death. Though not officially commemorated, people in the streets whispered about the day with a mixture of morbid curiosity and lingering fear. Would some new horror occur on that date? Would the gods strike down another undeserving victim? Superstition thrived in the city's taverns and alleyways. The Queen Mother, Cersei, took care to arrange a private mass in the Great September, dedicating prayers to her fallen son's memory. Tommen was too young to fully recall the details, but he accompanied his mother, kneeling in solemnity. Tyrion attended as well, out of a sense of obligation, though he did not linger. The memory of that day, Joffrey turning purple, the goblet clattering, haunted him still. Marjorie, for her part, showed the proper courtesy, wearing a subdued gown and a veil, but she did not appear overly distraught. If she felt relief at having escaped Joffrey's cruelty, she hid it well beneath gentle dignity. That evening, after the prayers concluded, a quiet hush fell over the Red Keep. Tyrion found himself in the castle's library, half-heartedly flipping through a tome on dragon lore. He could not focus. Eventually, the torch sputtered, and he realized the hour was late. He left the library, wandering aimlessly along darkened corridors until he reached the open-air walkway that overlooked the Blackwater Bay. The moon shone on the water, creating silver ripples that seemed to dance. He leaned against the balustrade, inhaling the cold night air. The city behind him was alive with faint lamplight, but out here, it seemed he could almost pretend he was alone, free of the labyrinth of power plays. But, of course, the illusions of freedom did not last. Footsteps announced a visitor. He turned to see Sansa Stark approaching, her face half-bathed in moonlight. She hesitated, as if startled to find someone else there. Then she offered him a tiny nod and moved to stand a short distance away, gazing at the bay herself. They stood in silence for a time, neither quite knowing what to say. Finally, Tyrion ventured, "Couldn't sleep." Sansa shook her head. "I kept thinking about how different my life was supposed to be." Tyrion gave a bitter chuckle. "A common malady in this city. We all expected different fortunes." Sansa breathed in, hugging her arms around herself. "Sometimes I imagine that day." She did not say Joffrey's name, but Tyrion knew which day she meant. "I remember how it felt like everything was swirling around me, how I was certain that if the guards looked at me, they'd see guilt. But there was no relief, not truly." Tyrion watched her face, taking in the tremor in her voice. "Death at a wedding is never a relief," he said quietly. Sansa turned those large, sad eyes upon him. "He was horrible to me, you know that, but I never wished, not like that. Not in front of everyone." She paused. "And yet I was so afraid the blame would land on me. I still wake at night expecting to be dragged to the dungeons." Tyrion understood that fear intimately. Had suspicion turned his way, he would be lucky if he ended up in a cell rather than beheaded. "The city has a way of keeping us all in fear," he replied softly. "That day changed everything. And nothing." Sansa nodded. "Yes," she whispered. They lapsed into another silence, the chill wind caressing their faces. At length, Sansa surprised him by speaking more candidly. "My lady mother used to say that the gods are just, that they weave a fate for each of us. If that's true, what was Joffrey's fate? Why was he born only to live so cruelly, then die so young?" Tyrion had no comforting answer. "I can't claim to know the gods' minds," he said. "Maybe some people's fates are warnings to the rest of us." Sansa inhaled sharply as though the notion wounded her. Then she shook her head. "I don't believe the gods arranged that. Men did. People who wanted power or revenge or..." She trailed off. He wanted to respond, to offer some insight, but found his throat constricting. He simply nodded. After a moment, she closed her eyes, whispering, "I hope someday that justice finds those who killed him, no matter how terrible he was. Because if there's no justice for Kingslayer's crimes, then what hope is there for anything else?" Tyrion felt a pang at her words. The notion that Joffrey's killers might never face consequence weighed on him, too. But he also knew that her concept of justice was shaped by her family's tragedies, that the entire realm was steeped in unpunished sins. "In King's Landing," he said gently, "justice is a rare bird. One seldom glimpsed." Sansa gave him a long, searching look. Then she turned back to the water. "Maybe," she murmured, "it's time for a new flock." They stood there for a while longer, the night deepening. Tyrion wondered if she would say more about wanting to leave the city to find some path to the north. But she remained silent. Finally, she left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until only the wind remained. Tyrion gazed once more at the moonlit bay, recalling the swirl of red wine that had spilled from Joffrey's goblet, the bright flush of poison on his lips. He felt no regret for that boy's passing. Yet the conversation with Sansa left him uneasy, as though he had brushed up against a moral question too complex to dismiss. Was the realm truly better off if murderers went unpunished as long as it preserved peace? He had often told himself so. But hearing Sansa's quiet plea for justice stirred something in him. Perhaps he was not so comfortable with the city's version of peace after all. In the weeks that followed, Tyrion refocused on immediate tasks. Rumors from the north about wildlings near the wall grew more urgent. Stannis, entrenched at Castle Black, sent repeated messages begging for men and supplies. Tywin refused, claiming House Lannister had no interest in propping up a defeated claimant. The Tyrells remained ambivalent, too distant from the frozen front to care. The Martells were silent, still nursing old wounds. The Iron Bank loomed as always. Tyrion orchestrated partial payments that bought more time. Meanwhile, Tommen grew from a timid boy into a somewhat less timid youth, overshadowed by Marjorie's confident presence. Cersei's paranoia mounted, though she kept it reined in under Tywin's stern eye. Jaime occasionally confided in Tyrion that Cersei had turned to Qyburn's counsel more and more, as if searching for a dark advantage. Jaime hated the man, suspecting him of unholy practices, but Cersei ignored his protests. Through all these developments, Tyrion remained the pragmatic linchpin of the city's finances and alliances. He was often exhausted, but he persevered. The city was his puzzle to solve, or at least to maintain. In the quiet corners of the Red Keep, he sometimes crossed paths with Sansa and exchanged perfunctory greetings. At formal events, they stood side by side as husband and wife in name only, a pair of outcasts forced into a union neither desired. She was always polite, yet distant. Tyrion could hardly blame her. Time had not healed her wounds, only scabbed them over with caution. One day, everything shifted yet again. A letter arrived bearing the sigil of the Eyrie, a falcon in flight. Tyrion was summoned at once to Tywin's private solar, where he found not only his father but also Cersei, Marjorie, and even Pycelle. The letter announced Lysa Arryn's death in the Vale. Apparently a tragic accident. She had fallen through the moon door. Tyrion's thoughts leapt to Baelish immediately. The letter further stated that Peter Baelish was now the sole regent for young Robert Arryn, controlling both the Eyrie and its formidable defenses. The Vale was effectively Baelish's domain, recognized by the local lords after some political maneuvering. Tywin frowned at the parchment. Too convenient by half, he muttered. Marjorie, reading over Tywin's shoulder, said quietly, Lord Baelish can't be trusted. Cersei glared at her, as if resenting the obvious statement. Pycelle shook his head, mumbling about the precarious state of alliances. Tywin then looked at Tyrion, his gaze heavy. We will need a different approach with the Vale. Baelish wields more power now than we anticipated. In the following days, the small council attempted to decipher Baelish's intentions. Would he remain nominally loyal to Tommen, or was he positioning himself to broker an alliance with another claimant? If Daenerys Targaryen truly arrived on Westerosi shores, might Baelish side with her? The possibilities were endless. Tyrion advised caution, emphasizing that Baelish's nature was to stir the pot, to test how the crown might react. The best tactic, Tyrion suggested, was to keep Baelish comfortable enough not to align with a rival. Tywin agreed, albeit grudgingly. And so, another set of envoys was prepared to parley with Lord Baelish, offering him minor concessions and reaffirming his role in the Vale. Tyrion could almost taste the bitter irony of it. The likely orchestrator of Joffrey's murder was being offered more power, more legitimacy. Yet the needs of the realm demanded it. The alternative, open conflict with the Vale, would only shatter the fragile peace. Not long after, Tyrion found himself alone with Varys in a shadowy corridor near the throne room. The Master of Whisperers glided to him, that familiar half-smile adorning his face. It seems we feed our enemies like they're our cherished children, does it not? Tyrion snorted. Baelish has a talent for making us do just that. We can't afford another war. Varys nodded, gazing at the gilded pillars around them. Indeed. And so the question becomes, how long before Lord Baelish decides he no longer needs our approval? Tyrion gave a lopsided shrug. We can only watch and wait. The eunuch's soft voice dropped lower. You once asked me about the truth of Joffrey's murder. I recall you had suspicions. Does it bother you that the man who likely arranged it is being rewarded? Tyrion felt a twist in his gut. Yes, but the alternative pulling at that thread would unravel everything. Varys studied Tyrion's face. You've grown adept at letting the ends justify the means, my lord. Tyrion let out a humorless laugh. I learned that from watching men like my father. And you, Spider. Varys inclined his head in acknowledgement. We all do what we must to survive in the capital. Then he slipped away, leaving Tyrion with the echoes of that uncomfortable truth. Time marched onward, and each new day brought fresh challenges. Cersei's resentment of Margaery grew like a thorn bush, barbed and unyielding, especially as the queen blossomed in popularity. Tommen's rule gained acceptance among the small folk, if only because it was less cruel than Joffrey's. Distant conflicts flickered across the horizon, Dorne, the north, Essos, but the capital, for the moment, remained eerily stable. Tyrion continued to manage finances, forging deals, appeasing creditors, preventing outbursts of unrest. It was a delicate dance. The memory of Joffrey's purple face sometimes intruded on him in dreams, but less frequently. Life had become a churn of duties, as though that day of regicide had always been fated to happen, an event that simply realigned the realm's course. One autumn day, a raven arrived from the wall, carrying dire warnings about an army of wildlings and the threat of something darker. Tyrion, recalling his journey to the wall long ago, felt a tug of concern. He tried to raise the alarm in the small council, urging them to at least dispatch some men or supplies. Tywin pointed out that the crown had already drained its coffers to hold the realm together. Cersei declared that it was the Night's Watch's duty to handle wildlings, not the crown's. Margaery listened thoughtfully, but her grandmother Olenna, absent from King's Landing at the time, couldn't weigh in. The result was predictable: inaction. Tyrion left the meeting frustrated, though not surprised. He wondered if Stannis might secure a new alliance by turning his attention northward, capitalizing on the fear of what lay beyond the wall. But that was the future's concern. The present required him to keep the capital's fragile calm intact. Another letter arrived a fortnight later, and this one was different, marked with a dragon seal. It purported to be from Meereen, signed Daenerys Targaryen. In it, the queen across the sea demanded recognition of her rightful claim to the Iron Throne and offered a truce of sorts if the usurpers, meaning House Lannister, would cede control to her when she arrived. Many a court scoffed, calling her a pretender with fancy illusions. Tyrion was not so quick to dismiss. He had read enough to know that dragons could shift the balance of power overnight. Tywin, however, believed that if Daenerys truly had dragons, she would pose a threat only when she mustered a fleet to cross the narrow sea. We have time, was the old lion's verdict. Margaery voiced caution: if the Targaryen queen truly liberated cities in Essos, she might bring an army of freedmen and sellswords. The conversation ended inconclusively, but Tyrion made a mental note to keep tabs on any news from across the sea. Through it all, the specter of Joffrey's murder lingered in the corners of the Red Keep. Officially, the city had moved on. Unofficially, there were always whispers. Some claimed it was a curse from the gods. Others said the ghost of Ned Stark had reached from beyond the grave to exact vengeance. A few conspirators believed Tyrion himself had done it, but with no proof or champion for that cause, the rumor never took hold. The fear that once threatened to swallow Tyrion had dissipated, replaced by the daily grind of politics. Oddly enough, that felt even more soul-draining than the fear of a single trial. Instead of the short, sharp terror of facing execution for a crime he didn't commit, Tyrion endured the slow suffocation of living each day in this nest of vipers, entangled in half-truths and precarious alliances. Yet he endured. He endured for reasons he sometimes could not fully articulate. Duty to the realm, loyalty to the family name that scorned him, a desire to protect Sansa from further harm, a sense of responsibility toward Tommen and even Margaery. The fleeting possibility that the Seven Kingdoms might yet become something better if men of reason guided it. And perhaps, too, there was a kernel of pride. A refusal to let the city break him, to prove that the dwarf Lannister could stand among the cunning and ruthless and not be destroyed. If that was hubris, so be it. The city devoured the weak. He would not be weak. So the story pressed forward. Season by season, plot by plot, rumor by rumor. Tyrion grew older and somewhat wiser, quietly shaping policies that kept King's Landing afloat. Cersei's mania remained contained by Tywin's iron hand, while Margaery's popularity soared. Jaime struggled with his changed identity, occasionally confiding in Tyrion, occasionally withdrawing to brood. Sansa drifted through the castle like a restless spirit, longing for a north she might never see again. Varys spun his webs, Bronn chased coin and titles, Pycelle dozed at council meetings, and the Gold Cloaks patrolled the winding streets where beggars prayed for scraps. Far away, the Targaryen queen gathered strength, the Iron Bank tallied debts, the wildlings prowled the cold frontier, and Peter Baelish wove new schemes in the mountains of the Vale. And always, Tyrion Lannister remembered the day that changed his life forever, the Purple Wedding, when King Joffrey Baratheon died choking on poison. That day might have spelled Tyrion's doom, but in a twist of fate, the blame never fell squarely at his feet. Instead, it set him on the path of uneasy survival, a path that demanded cunning, compromise, and a tolerance for secrets that might make a lesser man tremble. In a land where justice was as elusive as a ghost in the night, Tyrion found ways to live without answers, to accept the unsolved murder at the heart of the realm's tapestry. He bore that knowledge with him into every negotiation and council meeting, into every hushed conversation and midnight reflection. It became the silent oath he made to himself each day, to endure, to maneuver, to shape the city's destiny in small, subtle ways that might one day add up to real change. If he sometimes felt guilt or questioned whether it was right to let the true murderers remain free, he told himself that unveiling them would tear the kingdom apart. And perhaps that was no falsehood. House Tyrell was too vital to alienate and Baelish too cunning to confront without concrete proof. The realm needed stability. Tyrion had no illusions of heroism. He was not Ned Stark, guided by an unwavering moral compass. He was Tyrion Lannister, a man shaped by cruelty and scorn, yet still clutching at some kernel of decency, determined to make the best of a system built on treachery. In rare unguarded moments, he imagined a different life, a cottage by the sea, or a distant city in Essos where no one recognized his face, or even a seat in the North's crisp air beside Sansa if that improbable dream ever came to pass. Then he would laugh at himself for indulging in fantasy. The city held him in its grip, and he, for all his complaints, was a creature of courtly intrigue. He was too far in to simply walk away. So the days became months, and the months rolled into years. Tommen's reign would face new storms, new challengers, new heartbreaks and triumphs. House Lannister would see its share of conflict and tragedy. Tyrion, in the thick of it, would continue navigating that precarious line between loyalty and self-preservation, between cunning and empathy. He was, in many ways, the center of gravity for every clandestine negotiation, every covert peace. And though he seldom spoke of it, he never lost sight of how a single moment's twist, a single failure of suspicion to take hold, had granted him the chance to shape a future. A future that might, if guided carefully, spare countless lives and create a realm less defined by fear. In the quiet hours, perched upon the Red Keep's highest balcony, Tyrion would occasionally gaze toward the horizon, wondering what new events might one day rewrite the course of his life. Perhaps dragons truly would return, scorching the board clean. Perhaps winter's wrath and the rumored terrors beyond the wall would descend, demanding a unity that no one believed possible. Or perhaps some simpler impetus would arise, a shift in alliances, a death in some distant region that would upend the chessboard anew. Whichever shape fate took, Tyrion readied himself. He had survived the Purple Wedding, and in a city like King's Landing that was no small feat, survival, though, was only the beginning. The real game, the silent vow he had made to himself, was to make use of that survival. To help steer the realm, in increments and compromises, toward a semblance of stability that might outlast the next wave of chaos. As dawn broke over the black waters, Tyrion took a deep breath of the cool salt air. The gulls wheeled overhead, calling to one another in sharp cries. He sipped from a cup of watered wine, letting the tang of grapes coat his tongue. Another day beckoned, brimming with negotiations, false smiles, and potential betrayals. Another day in which he might tilt events, if only a fraction, toward a more balanced outcome. He could not change that men like Baelish walked free, nor could he remedy every injustice. But neither was he powerless. He had learned that he had a keen mind, a silver tongue, and enough grit to survive. In the end, that was all one could ask in a land where illusions were as potent as armies and where a king's death might spark either disaster or opportunity, or both at once. He listened to the city stirring below, the distant hum of voices, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rattle of harbor chains. Somewhere in the Red Keep, Tommen was rising from bed, Gary likely helping him prepare for the day's audiences. Cersei might already be awake, brooding over a cup of wine, plotting how to reclaim her lost influence. Tywin would be in his solar, reading letters and issuing orders. Sansa would be dressing in her subdued finery, uncertain if this day offered anything beyond routine. The wheels would turn as they always did. Tyrion set down his cup, squared his shoulders, and made his way inside. Let the city present its challenges. He would meet them one by one with sardonic wit and measured cunning. Because he remained Tyrion Lannister, alive, unaccused, and determined to prove his worth in a realm that had once written him off. Thus did time flow on in the seven kingdoms, forging new stories with each passing sunrise. Yet the memory of that single wedding feast, that brutal choke, that rattling final breath never fully faded from Tyrion's mind. The echoes of Joffrey's death resonated in every alliance, every unspoken pact. If the realm endured, if Tommen's gentler rule took root, if House Lannister kept its grip on the throne, much of it traced back to that day. A day that might have ended with Tyrion in chains, but instead opened the door to his uneasy future. He was neither hero nor villain, just a man who, when fortune's arrow flew past him, made the most of the reprieve. In King's Landing, that was more than most dared hope for. So he pressed on, forging a legacy as subtle and unassuming as a spider's silk, aware that in the shadows of the Red Keep, secrets and destinies wove together in ways that even the gods themselves might find astounding. And if, somewhere in that labyrinth, justice waited, well, perhaps Tyrion would find a way to coax it out into the light, piece by careful piece. Until then, he would wield the tools he had, words, wit, alliances, and the hard-earned knowledge that survival itself could be a quiet form of triumph.